Good day, everyone. Thank you for signing into this webinar. I guess I should put my face here. My name is Sandra Henniger, and I am a member of the coordinating committee for the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing. Today is the first of a three-part webinar series on disability and human rights in Nova Scotia. Each webinar will build upon the other, and we hope by the end of the third webinar that we will have created enough discussion to bring us to some actions that we can take to ensure government's promises of equity.
You're both in the same meeting.
Our second and third webinar will be held in late January and late February. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge that Halifax is located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy's people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact, recognized the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We acknowledge that our practices and methods are founded in colonial ways of knowing and thinking, and that we must work to create better relations through the lens of truth and reconciliation. Today, we planned for an hour-and-a-half webinar that would end around 1:30 today with 3 speakers, but unfortunately, one of our speakers was unable to make it. So we'll hear from our 2 speakers and then have ample time for questions at the end. Everyone except the speaker should be on mute, and we ask that if you want to make a question during the speaker's comments, that you use the chat function or even comments there, and that those questions and comments can be addressed at the end of the presentations. You can find the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and please feel free to use that to ask or to make comments. You can also put in there a little bit of information about yourself if you'd like, where you're coming from and maybe what organization you are representing as you are listening to this webinar. The webinar will be taped. I think everyone saw that notice, and then it will be later posted either on our Nova Scotia Action Coalition page or also on the YouTube page for the coalition. So first of all, let me see. You can see the transcript. There was a question there. Do we need to address that question now? I want to introduce Tammy. Tammy Bernasky is an assistant professor in the Department of New, Political, and Social Studies at Cape Breton University. She has been working on disability rights and inclusion for more than 20 years at the local, national, and international levels. In addition to lived experience of disability, Tammy has a PhD in critical disability studies from York University and has recently published her research in the book entitled Working to End Gender-Based Violence in the Disability Community, International Perspectives. Recognizing the intersectional nature of our identities, Tammy is committed to qualitative research practices that center the voices and stories of people with disabilities. Welcome, Tammy.
Thank you for that introduction, Sandra. I think Roshni is going to share the screen for me. Thank you. So as Sandra said, my name is Tammy Bernasky, and I'm delighted to be speaking today about disability and the fight for human rights. And part of the reason I was interested in doing this is because I think it's really important to raise awareness, but also be in a space where stories are being shared about related to lived experience. So today I'm going to talk about disability and the fight for human rights. You want to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I did include a land acknowledgement in the slide deck, and thank you, Sandra, for that land acknowledgement. I'm also in Mi'kma'ki, being in Sydney, Nova Scotia at Cape Breton University. The objectives for today, I'm going to really look at contextualizing disability a little bit, and then I'll talk a little bit more about human rights principles, and accessibility legislation that applies to Canada and particularly Nova Scotia as well. From there, I'll lead into a discussion a little bit about attitudes, values, and beliefs related to disability. And all of this is important because we need to really be talking about the barriers that exist for people with disabilities and other aspects of identity. So we'll move on to the next slide about disability. So Canada is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And interestingly, the convention itself does not define disability in ways that you might expect. So in fact, disability is described as an evolving concept within the convention. And to quote, actually, it says that disability is an evolving concept and that disability results from an interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environment barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So there are all kinds of lived experiences and conditions that would fall under the definition of disability. So in terms of statistics, the most widely accepted statistic comes from the World Report on Disability, and it says that 15% of the world's population live with a disability. When that report was written in 2010, the population was lower, and at that point, it would have been about 1 billion people. So the numbers are actually higher now. If you want to think about it in terms of minority groups, folks who identify as having a disability are among the largest minority group in the world. In Nova Scotia, about 30.4% of Nova Scotians identify as having a disability, and that's one of the largest percentages in the country. I will say, in terms of defining disability and recognizing it, that what we know in terms of statistics might not be complete because a lot of people don't necessarily identify as having a disability. People can move in and out of having disability experiences, and all kinds of other factors that might impact reporting around disability. So I'm going to turn now to models of disability, and there are a lot of different models that represent the ways that disability are understood. And I could talk about many of them, but I've decided to focus on just 3 for today, recognizing that there are many more that can be considered here. Certainly when I started learning about disability in terms of a field of study, these were the models that came to my attention. So the first one that I'm going to talk about today is the medical model. And the medical model really places the problem of accessibility with the individual rather than with society. So it's very heavily focused on medical aspects of disability, and it's really about fixing the individual to fit into society. And you can see this model playing out in many different systems, whether it's the education system when people have to qualify for educational assistance of some kind, or in the medical systems, or if you're trying to access supports, you need to qualify medically for different kinds of supports as well. So the social model really takes the conversation away from the individual and looks at the way that society creates barriers for individuals. So rather than focusing on the individual, it turns and looks at the ways that interactions with society and attitudinal barriers and things like that really do shape the experience of disability. And this model really emerged in the 1980s, so around the same time that the human rights approaches, when human rights was becoming more prevalent, the social model emerged as well. From there is a rights-based approach to disability, and there are a lot of advocates who worked on rights-based approaches and really taking the conversation away from just looking at society, but also looking at people with disabilities as rights holders. And certainly we can see that with the added Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So really it looks at rights along with how to meet rights of people with disabilities. So what I'm going to do next is just talk a little bit about disability rights. So there are three different things I want to talk about briefly. Certainly the first one would be the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada ratified in 2010. And then there's the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act, which came into force in 2017. So that's our accessible legislation here. And then there's the Accessible Canada Act, which is the newer of the three kinds of legislation that Canada adheres to in terms of accessibility and disability. And that was enacted in 2017. So the first one is the convention. So if we think about human rights principles, there are really 5 principles that are within the human rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So Vashni, if you want to move to the next slide. Great, thank you. So these are the principles of dignity, autonomy, participation, inclusion, and accessibility, non-discrimination and equality, and then respect for difference. And so to talk about these, many of these principles are outlined within the convention and also within other human rights or disability rights conventions and accessibility legislation as well. Certainly, dignity is a core element of human rights. Autonomy would be around things like being able to make decisions about your own life and having control in your day-to-day activities. Participation, inclusion, and accessibility certainly would align with accessibility legislation, but also, participation in various aspects of life. So whether it's education, home life, or how you participate in your home life, recreation, out in society, access to justice, those sorts of things. So there's all different kinds of areas of life where participation and inclusion is important, even employment and other things as well. And then there's non-discrimination and equality. So these principles are really about ensuring that people are not discriminated against based on different aspects of identity. And what I want to say here is that nothing within the convention actually creates new rights for people with disabilities, but it just brings attention to the ways that people with disabilities need to have a space to ensure that their rights are being upheld as they would be for anybody else. And then respect for difference. So there's nothing in the convention that talks about preventing disability because that goes against the inherent nature of the convention. It really talks about respecting who we are as individuals and respecting difference as well. So these are the core principles of the Human Rights Convention, or sorry, the Disability Rights Convention. The next one is the Accessible Canada Act, and that came into play in 2019. Again, the objective is the full and equal participation of all people with disabilities, and it's looking at improving accessibility and preventing barriers and removing barriers in the area of the built environment, employment, goods and services, the design of programs and services, communication and transportation. Again, the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act is quite similar. So if you want to go to the next slide, thank you. It's like the ACA. Again, it focuses on accessibility in the areas of goods and services, information and communication, transportation, employment, built environment, education, and other prescribed activities or undertaking. So really all of these different acts and the convention really look at making sure that people with disabilities have access to the same services in all areas of life that other people have. So I'm going to turn now to ableism. Ableism is defined as discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing, and that's in quotes, and defines people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than, and this includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations about people with disabilities. So much of my work is really about addressing ableism, and I'm very much focused on perception. I'm quite fascinated by perception, but I also think it's really important to understand how perceptions of people with disabilities play out in our daily lives. And in my own work, I've looked a lot at internalized ableism. So looking at the ways that when people are told things for so long that aren't correct about themselves, they start to believe it because they hear it so long. And so it's really internalized, that ableism that we're speaking about here. And then there's ableism externally as well, from the way that systems are set up, attitudes and beliefs in society. And so the next thing I would like to talk about are attitudes. And I've done a little bit of work around attitudes and perception, and I've taught in the area of representation of disability in the media. And I'm really passionate about this because the media really does inform and reflect the way that disability is understood within societies, and often the way that it's represented in media and other types of communications, it's really quite negative in terms of attitudes. So these negative attitudes about disability persist. And there are a lot of tropes, as we say, that really are perpetuated in media and reflected in media. And those are that, having a disability is undesirable, that it might be tragic. If you look at story plot lines in movies, often it's the tragic nature of disability that's highlighted. People with disabilities aren't often represented in movies, for example, just for the sake of being in everyday life like everybody else. Usually there's a plot that's wrapped around the person with a disability, and it really is reflected in these negative attitudes. So things like, people with disabilities are unproductive and that they can't contribute to society. That's a common belief, and that plays out in media, but it also plays out in other areas, particularly around employment and things like that. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But other attitudes are that people with disabilities are a burden. It's pitiful to have a disability. We need saving. I identify as a person with a disability. So when I say we, I mean people with disabilities. And also there's this other attitude that might look like it's a positive one, but it's actually quite negative. And that's the idea that we're heroic just for getting out of bed in the morning and doing everyday things. And that can be quite harmful for people. And I guess the main point here is that these misconceptions are perpetuated in society, and they really do lead to different levels of discrimination. We can talk more about intersectionality and how other aspects of identity interact with disability to create even more barriers. But for today, I'm going to focus just on the negative perceptions in general towards people with disabilities. Okay, so in terms of poverty, and kind of the reason why we're talking today is to look at the way that systems and structures are set up to advantage some people and disadvantage others. And so if we think about the link between disability and poverty, there is a strong link. It's quite bi-directional, and it's universal. It's known that if you have a disability, you're more likely to live in poverty. There's all kinds of reasons for that, whether it's that you don't have access to adequate employment, and that might be because you didn't have access to adequate education, right? And so when there's barriers set up in these areas, it can be very difficult for people to advance their careers and to have social support set up for them in ways that support their well-being. In terms of education, the number of students with disabilities, and I put some, just a couple of references at the end of the PowerPoint, and you'll see the little numbers there, but at the end, you'll see some resources, but there's a lot more work being done around education. And there are more people with disabilities, or more students with disabilities entering post-secondary education. That number is on the rise, but there are still a number of barriers that exist. And the graduation rates are actually quite low compared to other groups of people. And so that's an issue. The other issue is around employment. So I've done a bit of work primarily in Ontario before I moved back home to Nova Scotia. So I did my PhD at York University, and while I was doing my PhD, I was fortunate to work for the Centre for Research on Work and Disability Policy. And they looked a lot at social supports and employment supports, and really looked at what it meant to be a disability confident employer. And what I mean there is that there's a lot of misconceptions in employment, that particularly among employers, that if I hire a person with a disability, they're not going to be as productive, and or they're going to be a liability. And that's simply not the case. And so working towards having disability confident employers means that employers actually understand that there's quite a business case to be made for hiring people with disabilities in terms of, retention rates and things like that. And so these are certainly two areas that are really important. The other part that is really important in this conversation is that a lot of people with disabilities are unable to work either at all or full time. And so the social safety net that's set up right now it was set up as a system of last resort, but for a lot of people with disabilities, it's the first system that they interact with and the only one. And so there's concerns there about improving social supports across Canada so that people with disabilities aren't living in poverty. And I think a good example there was when we had the COVID response and the emergency benefit was $2,000, right? So if you were working and then all of a sudden you couldn't work because of the pandemic, the benefit that you got was $2,000 a month. So what a lot of advocates are now saying is that, well, if that's the case for people who were working and then couldn't, if you're going to try to give them, $2,000, then why can't that be the case for everybody else who isn't able to work under different circumstances? And I think there's a really strong case there to be made for universal basic income, which there's a lot of advocacy around as well in terms of ensuring that all Canadians, all people living here have access to a basic income that supports their well-being. Okay, so I recognize that there are some comments and questions in the chat box, and I will get to those. It's just if I switch screens right now, I might lose where I'm at. So I will get to your comments and questions when I finish this section. Okay, so in my own work, looking at gender-based violence and disability, one of the themes that emerged from my work was really around structural barriers. And when I talk about violence in my own work, I also talk about socioeconomic status and poverty, because there's a strong correlation between disability and poverty, but also if you add in the element of experiencing violence, it can be very difficult to move outside of those situations if you're dependent upon other people. So anyway, all of that to say is that much of my work looked at structural barriers as well. And certainly we know that there are policy landscapes in place in Canada, particularly in the provinces, because that's where a lot of policy plays out, that are really complex. And a lot of systems, they just don't talk to each other. And to make it even more complicated, if you move across provinces and territories in Canada, if you have a permanent disability, that status doesn't necessarily follow you across the country, which to me is ridiculous, because if you have a permanent disability, you shouldn't have to keep proving it. So we can talk about all kinds of complexities there in terms of if you need to prove a disability, so going back to that medical model I just mentioned at the beginning, if you have to prove a disability, that usually costs money. You have to pay a doctor to fill out the forms necessary to prove that you have a disability. And so we can think about this in terms of the disability tax credit, for example. It's a very complicated process. Often people are denied because if you don't have a very obvious disability, there's a lot of screening out of people. And so those systems are really complicated. Housing, transportation, social and income support systems, they all impact people with disabilities, and they're often not adequately equipped to meet the people's needs. And because these systems don't necessarily talk to each other, there's even more barriers there. So trying to navigate a system when you're already experiencing barriers in other areas of life can be really overwhelming for people when they're stuck in situations where the different departments don't talk to each other, but a person's daily life is impacted by housing, it's impacted by transportation and income supports and things like that, but these systems just don't necessarily communicate in ways that are effective with people that are impacted by them. Okay, so let's turn the conversation over to housing. I really just want to reiterate that with barriers to education and employment, people with disabilities often have to rely upon income and social supports. And there's a lot of situations where people don't have access to accessible and affordable housing. So it's one thing to have accessible housing, it's one thing to have affordable housing, but to find the two together, it's almost impossible for a lot of people, and it's necessary for a lot of people. And so just to mention briefly, there's newer legislation in Canada around medical assistance in dying, for example. And we know that people in Nova Scotia have applied for medical assistance in dying partly because they couldn't find housing that accommodated their needs. And they've been approved, right? And so if we think about systems and structural barriers and things like that, if we have a situation in place where people are finding it easier in some ways to apply for medical assistance in dying than living, then there's obviously an issue there. So I guess to conclude my portion, I would say that the burden is often placed on people with disabilities to advocate for supports and services. So Rashni, if you want to move to the final slide there, please. Thank you. So people are often placed in a situation where they have to advocate for their own supports and services. In order to remove barriers to accessibility, we need to have more conversations about the experiences of people with disabilities and the challenges they face around negative perceptions. We also need structural change to remove barriers in all areas of life. So I want to turn it over to Vicky, who's now going to speak about her experience with housing, and then I'll come to the questions and comments, and I'll address those at the end. Thank you. Go ahead, Vicky. Oh, Vicky, you're still on mute, so just.
And if I can just do a little introduction of Vicky before she begins.
Oh, sure.
So Vicky Levack is a 31-year-old disability and human rights activist who focuses on the right to housing in the community. She is spokesperson for the Disability Rights Coalition of Nova Scotia, as well as the PADS Community Advocacy Network. She is a passionate public speaker and always strives to do what is best for her community. She recently had the opportunity to speak to the provincial government to offer her thoughts on Bill 96, which is the new anti-discrimination and hate bill being developed for Nova Scotia. She has also had some experience in film and camera, I think it is, and has been involved in several documentary films, and her first fiction role in Spencer McKay's film Interrelation will be performing in about a month. Sorry, Vicky, about that. You can tell us a little bit more.
That's lovely, thank you. Okay, so hi guys, I'm Vicky, and Tammy gave you a sort of it seemed thorough, but this issue is very complicated. So it was just the primer for what we're facing here in Nova Scotia and indeed across Canada. Until very recently, I was forced to live in an institution against my will for 10 years. I did not want to live in an institution. That was not where my goal was. But I was told, quote, my care needs were too high, close quote, and that none of the services that community services offered would fit my needs. So rather than create a new program, they moved a 21-year-old woman into a senior's home with a bunch of dementia and other mental health issues that were not being treated. For the other residents, my own mental health was not taken seriously. I told them I had depression and suicidal ideation, and they didn't know what to do with that. I said, okay, well, let me talk to a counselor. They didn't have one on staff, which is weird because the amount of mental health like difficulties that a person has tends to skyrocket when one moves into long-term care. And I will explain why that is. I mean, I'm no doctor, but those places are warehouses for human beings. We are not that much. The on-the-road staff, at least in my facility, were great. Yeah, but the management and the way things were run higher up, I mean, you know the crisis we're facing in long-term care. So as a result, many of us, if not all of us, didn't exactly get the care we needed. We got enough to keep us alive, but in terms of being treated like human beings, there was simply no time for that. To treat us like people. And first I got in this work for me because I was like, I got screwed over. I don't like this. And then I looked around me about a year later and I said, wait a minute, it's not just happening to me. This is not a crack in the system. This is how the system functions. Like the system is not broken, it's working as intended, which is to deny people services that they need because it costs money. So government's job is not to tell you yes in those circumstances. The government's job is to tell you, no, you don't qualify. They're to deny as much as they can and do the cheapest option, regardless of whether it's against human rights or not. Now, we have a ruling from the Supreme Court of, the Court of Appeal of Nova Scotia. And it says, yes, you've been discriminating against people with disabilities by forcing them to live in institutions and not giving them other options. That's wrong. It's discriminatory. You have to stop doing that. Now, the Premier did try to go to the Supreme Court of Canada to get it overturned. The Supreme Court said basically, get out of here with your nonsense, and refused to hear the case. So now that they've run out of options to fight us, they're now working with us. We have a joint force between the organization that I represent, the Disability Rights Coalition, who was one of the lead plaintiffs in the case that went to the Human Rights Tribunal, Human Rights Board. So yeah, so we got that, and now the government is working with us, and we're working with Maria Manueli, who is the head of the Disability Support Program for Nova Scotia Community Services, and their lawyers, and with a man named Eddie Bartlett, who is a really, really famous system transformer. He closed all the institutions in Australia and provided, gave them a plan to provide community-based options. He and Tim Stanton, who is out of BC and works at a university in British Columbia, but I don't know what it is, the University of British Columbia, they got together and they're forming a plan after we had a week of consultations with the disability community and service providers and government folk. And now that they have all that information, they are to do a report on what they've learned and what some of the solutions may be. And then that report is due to be out at the end of January. It is to go back to court. Both parties, meaning the DRC and the government, go, yep, that looks good. And then they implement it with the help of a court order with times dictated by the court. And the court will be overseeing the implementation. It's the fact that we had to do this is totally gross, and it shouldn't have taken. Well, this case started in 2014. I've only been involved for the past two and a half years, but this case has been going on since 2014. It's now 2022, and we are just getting to maybe a solution if we all agree to it. But what this will do is make it so people like me will never be forced into institutions again and be forced to make the choice that is not really a choice. And I mean, now I'm out, I'm in an apartment run by ILNS, that's Independent Living Nova Scotia. They're really great. They're not used to the service provision. We are the first people to be involved in this project. There will be 4 of us. We're sort of the guinea pigs, and then it's to be expanded once they work out the kinks. And then, yeah, it's a lot of work, and it shouldn't have taken this long, but at least we're getting to the end of it now, which means nobody will have to go through what I went through, because trust me, it was traumatic and it shouldn't have happened, and I'm still mad about it. So yeah, oh, and I also work with the homeless population, many of whom have either cognitive or mental health disabilities or physical disabilities. Those communities tend to overlap, and many people with disabilities, as we all know, live in poverty. So all these things are connected in one giant web of systematic oppression that we need to stop.
I think you've raised a lot of really great points there, Vicky. Do you mind if I jump in for a moment?
No, of course, go ahead, Doc.
I just want to follow up on some of the things that you're saying, and also the comments that relate to what you're saying as well. I should have said more clearly in the beginning when I was talking about the disability experience. There's a range of disabilities that exist. There are physical disabilities, but there are also invisible disabilities. So there are disabilities that you can see and disabilities that you can't. There are things like sensory disabilities, neurodivergence, all kinds of different experiences that when interacting with society actually create disabilities for folks. And so I think it's really important to recognize also that people can have episodic disabilities. So sometimes people will have a disability and then they don't have it. It can come and go for some people, so that can impact your life in different ways. And if we think about it from an intersectional policy analysis perspective, one of the things that you would look at is time and place, right? And so the way that we experience disability at one time in one place can be very different than, say, a different time or a different place. And so I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about, one of the comments here was that when we talk about policy, it's not just about the policies, but people paid to implement them. And I think there's a lot of perception there that is misunderstood, right? In terms of the complexity of identity and the complexity of the ways that we experience things. Vicky, you've made some really great points. You know, people can experience multiple kinds of disabilities as well. Just because people have a physical disability, for example, doesn't mean that they don't have other kinds of disabilities that you don't see, for example. And so I think it's really important to recognize that you can't understand somebody's experience simply by looking at them.
No, if you've met one person with a disability, congratulations, you've met one person with a disability.
Right, exactly. So people can have the same impairment, but have very different experience of it. And that can be based on your physical embodiment or your other kinds of embodiments. It can be based on your socioeconomic status, your gender, all kinds of different things, right? And so I think it's really important to understand that everybody is very individual when it comes to, so I say that there's a disability community, there are disability communities, it's a large minority group, but it's actually quite diverse. And even the way that we describe disabilities can be very different for different groups of people, right? You also talked about, the system is working exactly as it's intended. I remember the first time somebody said that to me, I was a bit surprised because I kept saying, the system is broken, it's broken, people are not getting what they need. And the point was made, Vicky, you make a good point. The system is working as it's intended often, and usually that's to screen people out, right? It's to make sure that only a limited number of people are accessing resources and things like that. And so we really need to think about what those processes look like and how to really support people. Another thing that you said, Vicky, was really around having choice about your daily living, and I think that really speaks to one of the principles that we talked about, which was around autonomy, right? So we really need to think about what it means for people to have autonomy in their lives. And sometimes that might be supported decision-making. Sometimes that might be like other kinds of decision-making, but people should have input into where they live, for example, or, the kinds of things that impact their daily life. And so I think you're raising a lot of really good points there. Thank you for that.
And by not giving people those choices, they're really putting people behind. Like, I moved in here and we went to the grocery store to get my first set of groceries, and I realized just how much I don't know. Like, they're like, what brand of milk do you buy? I don't know. I've never bought milk. So people are like, what do you buy? What brands do you like? I don't know. How do you make your favorite meals? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, so even if we think about transitions, we need to think about ways to support people to learn those things if they don't already know them, and to really understand what it is that people need to make those kinds of decisions in your daily life. Those are things that people don't think about unless they have to think about them, right? We wouldn't necessarily think about the fact that you might not have known what kinds of milk you drink because you didn't get to make those choices, right? And that can be really important for somebody's autonomy and dignity and all of those other things as well.
Yeah, a lot of the answers to these basic questions that you would know, and I'll learn them. But right now, my answer to most of my aides is, I don't know, but we'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm. So really making sure that people are in place to support you, to ensure that you can,
Yeah.
knowing what kinds of questions to ask to support you in those decision-making processes.
Yeah, because I'm also neurodiverse, so I have a learning disability called nonverbal learning disorder, which means you have to communicate with me in a very specific way in order for me to understand. So lots of times neurodivergent people or neurotypical people, sorry, like they just don't say what they mean, or they'll hint at stuff that they're like, well, that's implied. And I'm like, well, I didn't get that. So if you want me to do something, don't just be like, but you have to tell me step by step. Vicky, I want you to do this. And then after you do this, I want you to do that. And then do this and do that. Or, hey, Vicky, what do you think about this? What if we do it this way? Like, because sometimes I don't have the answers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if you help me figure it out, we can do it together. But I have to be involved a lot of the time in the nursing home. My decisions were made for me, not with me. And I just sort of went along with it because they were all, unless it was really heinous, I went along with it because there were 3 staff for 19 people on my unit. So, I was willing to put up with a lot of crap because they said we didn't have time to not do it crappy. Now I'm out of that, and I have 3 staff, and now there's 4 residents instead of 19. So like, it's much better. My anxiety is way down. That's another thing. It really affected my mental health. I've been diagnosed with suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety since I was 14. I probably had it before that, but that's when it started. I wasn't diagnosed till I was 19, but we think it started around 14. And living in an environment where there's a reason they call nursing homes Jesus' waiting room. It's like they put you there to die. So I had to sit there every day and watch very sick people die. And I could do nothing to help. That's going to take a toll on anything. I felt guilty for asking for a glass of juice because they didn't have time. And now I don't have to feel guilty about that. I can just have juice. Like, things like that are like everything you take for granted as an able-bodied person being able to go do stuff. Like, I can shower whenever I want now. I couldn't do that in the nursing home. I was scheduled, and if you missed it, oh well, you'll get it next week.
Vicky, there's
Yes.
a lady, one of our participants, who has lots of work within the disability area, and she wanted to ask you a question. So Karen, if Rasha, you could unmute Karen and she could ask the question to Vicky. Karen Fowler, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Karen.
Vicky?
Yeah, hi
Hi,
Karen.
how's it going?
It's
Yeah,
going.
well, thank you for presenting. My question for you is, now that you're in an ILS program and you're getting people in there helping you, are you getting the support that you're looking for in regards to setting the goals to learn the skills to become more independent?
Yes, and yeah, and I have a lot of life skills because I sort of developed well with my parents when I was a teenager, but then I sort of stumbled my way through it in my 20s because there was no one to like help me. I sort of
Yep.
had to figure it out on my own, and I did that. But now, like, if I say something, I don't know this. My main assistant Joanne will sit with me and be like, "Okay, let's break this down, and we'll talk about step by step what you need to do."
Great. Okay. So that's what I always hoped for when my clients were getting connected with people. And that's what I always talk to them about. But not all services are always on the same page. Not all services always have the same skills for that kind of thing, or even the same, what I call intuition about even keeping it simple that way, because a lot of assumptions are made. So that's why I wanted to ask if you were getting what it was you were looking for. So that's really good for me. I've retired from what I did, but I'm doing stuff in a different capacity now. And one of them is most definitely, we've created a society called the Adaptive Paddling Solution Society. We're just in our infancy, but it's about making the idea of getting on the water a little bit more accessible for people of all abilities. The people that don't fit into what the other presenter was saying, not the mainstream, but what was that other word? Typical things. And so we're hoping to get that up and going. It's going to be all sort of in an online, but it's all about creating awareness of diverse abilities and how you become aware of that to answer those questions, right? So certainly what you're saying and what people are saying today is very useful for us.
Excellent.
So thank you.
You're welcome. Also, I want to paddle in a boat, so keep me in mind for that, eh? I want to go on a boat.
Well, yeah, and that will be when that comes out. We're slowly going to build, once we figure out our social media and our website and develop our manual and stuff. I am in the process of trying to create a very large spreadsheet with who we're going to access. And Pauline Halstead is my other person on it. This is her brainchild. It comes from an organization she started in London, Ontario, called Abilities in Motion. So you can Google that.
Are they the people who do the adaptive surfing? Because I think I've done adaptive surfing with them.
I don't think they do adaptive surfing. They do adaptive paddling, but I have seen the adaptive surfing stuff and some stuff has happened around the province, I think, related to that, because I'm just becoming familiar with that. But Pauline is so knowledgeable about, she's been doing it for over 20 years, right? And so our idea is to get the information out there and the resources out there so that other people can build the capacity for it. So and take people out. So one of our members, Sarah, is in a wheelchair, and she was involved with Pauline in Ontario, and Sarah's now in St. John, New Brunswick, but Sarah paddles. So anyway, we do have a Facebook page, Adaptive Paddling Solutions, and an Instagram, but it doesn't have much on it because we're only a small group of people, and I don't know anything about any of that social media stuff. So, but you can check us out, and we will post more up there. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
All right. Bye.
I'm wondering if there's anyone else that might have a specific question for either Tammy or Vicky at this time. I see there's a number of comments in the chat function around acronyms, and I think some of them, some of the comments may also talk about something that Tammy has mentioned, that across the country, you know, there's no consistency in how things are done or accessible. So I'll just leave that open if anyone wants to make any comments there.
Well, the good thing is we have well, not fully, but we're starting the Accessible Canada Act. So that will hopefully, correct me if I'm wrong, Tammy, create a national set of standards so there's not changes depending on what province you're in.
That's right. Yeah, we do have the Accessible Canada Act, which is meant to, you know, obviously it's across Canada. There's still a long way to go in terms of, it's a newer act, so the implications of it, I think, are yet remain to be seen. I see there's some hands raised from Colleen and Rose. So I don't know, maybe Colleen, I think I saw your hand first. If you wanna.
Me? Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
thanks. Thank you, Tammy and Vicky. It was, I very much appreciated the information that you presented, and Vicky, to hear about the lived experience just reinforces the situation. I got the impression from a lot of the issues that are being faced here, it was about money saving. As you described, Tammy, the system is set up the way it's supposed to be because it's to screen people out. The more you get out of the system, the better. And that's really about saving money. And I think of all the years people have been discriminated against based on that idea that the government is spending money, wasting money, you know, whatever, you know, to give the barest minimum they can to support people. And that's people with disabilities, it's people with on lower income, on social assistance. I mean, the policies are there that require people to live below the poverty line. So I'm thinking about the attitudes and the values that you talked about, Tammy, the attitude or the belief that people are unproductive, because that's an economic analysis. You're not working for a living, so therefore you're unproductive. So any other non-wage, non-paying activities have absolutely no value in our society. I mean, that was very obvious. Is it still very obvious with women that stay home and raise children are not productive and they don't produce any money. And I'm wondering, I mean, to me, this seems to be a huge issue. One thing is you need to go and make an argument economically why it's good to support people and why it's good to give them a living wage and access to housing and education, because there is an economic analysis to that. But it also upsets me is that we even think that way. If we think, and this is paraphrasing somebody else, people think we live in an economy, but we need to think we really live in a society. Because if we think about we live in a society and we think about the people that contribute to our society, there's all kinds of people that don't, quote, work, that contribute to our society. All our seniors of where I am now, you know, I contribute to this society, but I'm unproductive now. And there's so many like that. But I mean, that's the mentality. So I'm thinking we've got to change that mentality, but I guess we also need to make that economic argument as to why it makes more sense that everyone has their rights to housing and education, and people that have been traditionally exceptionally discriminated against are people with disability, but also racialized communities and indigenous communities. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Tammy or Vicky, but thank you.
Well, I know economically, like with this new program that I'm in, if I make over $350 a month, they'll start clawing back my benefits.
Of course it does.
Yeah, yeah.
300.
So don't be too productive, Vicky.
I know, but and I'm like, but I work.
Mhm.
Like, I'm not gonna stop working. Like, and when I get paid, which I don't get paid for a lot of my labor, but I get paid for some of it. It's often like for my speeches, like it's $50 an hour. That's what I charge. People think I should charge more, but I don't want to do that. So I can only do like 6 speeches a month, or face the consequences. Or I work in a gig economy, right? So right now I have a contract with CBC for 3 audio documentaries that are going to be 5 minutes each, and they're paying me $950. But that doesn't mean that like I'm going to get $950 every month. This is a one-time contract. So there are some months where I can make a lot, and then other months or months at a time where I make nothing because I'm strictly contract based.
And that's really complicated. I remember in Ontario when we were looking at this kind of situation, Vicky, people would make more money in 1 month, their benefits would be clawed back, but the next month they weren't making the same amount. But for the system to catch up and pay them what they were supposed to, it takes many more months for the system to catch up than it does for them to take the money back. And so that creates a lot of uncertainty for people who are relying upon benefit systems that will take money away if you make anything more than a very small amount in the first place. In terms of the economic argument, Colleen, I think what comes to mind for me, so I teach a health policy course here at CBU, and if I had to make an economic argument for giving people universal basic income or income supports, or setting up people so that they don't have to people who don't work, that they don't have to rely upon other people to help them, that there should be a universal basic income. If I had to make an economic case for that, I would go to the social determinants of health. So we know that in countries that are privatized in terms of healthcare, there was no more access for people. And it actually turns out that if you address the social determinants, socioeconomic determinants of health, that actually has better health outcomes than privatizing systems and throwing money into a system, right? And so if you want to make an economic case for supporting people, one of the primary social determinants of health is income, because that affects every area of life. And so if you give people basic income, it follows then that will impact every other area of life. It will decrease the burden on the healthcare system, for example. There's all kinds of economic benefits to making sure that people have an adequate standard of living, never mind that it's the right thing to do, right? Human rights wise, it's the right thing to do. And so I think if I had to make the economic case, it would be that if you address universal basic income and supporting people in the way that they need, that will then fall into every other area of life, and it will really support people. Yeah.
Tammy, you had noticed that we had a hand raised by Rosemarie and Sean. So maybe Rosemarie, if you still have a comment or question.
I do. Thank you to everybody. I really appreciate this presentation. I think we have a very intentional system, and it's to put people down. I don't know how many of you may be aware, we have a daughter in a small option setting now. And because of COVID, I came to find out that this small option home and all others under DCS is operated under the Act of Long-Term Care, which means that they're totally told when to eat, what to eat, where to eat, what to do, when to go. It's just as I hear Vicky, and this is what I'm experiencing for other 10 years. And I don't understand why it falls under that act.
Well, because people with disabilities are inherently medicalized. Like, we're automatically, the minute we exit the womb, and sometimes even before we exit the womb, we are medicalized. And like, I grew up in the 90s. I was a little kid in the 90s. So my doctor, his thing was, we have to fix her. She's broken, we have to fix her. You know, we'll just correct this and break this bone and put it over here, and it's all about fixing me instead of finding ways to adapt the world to my body. It was, I have to adapt this little girl's body to the world through severe medicalization and cutting her open multiple times. And most of the time, those surgeries didn't even help. They just caused more pain and more trauma psychologically, and sometimes physically. They did an operation on my hip, and now I used to be able to weight bear. I can't do that anymore because they botched the surgery. So that's why, because they think we're disabled, we're stupid, we can't do anything. We're small children in adult bodies. That's what they think of us. And that's probably what they think of your kid. She doesn't know what's best for her, but me as a neurotypical able-bodied person, I know what's best. That's just my theory.
Yeah. Thanks for both of those comments. Thanks. Yeah. Difficult situations. And many people with very similar kinds of circumstances, as we can see. This is just a small grouping of people. We heard earlier from Tammy that 30.4% of our population in Nova Scotia have a disability of some sort. And as many have said also, not all disabilities are counted or considered. And I think Sean had his, her hand up.
I take his or her, doesn't matter.
Sorry.
No worries. I can't see anybody, so I'd keep my camera off anyway. I wanted to put out some housing news. The Nova Scotia Not-for-Profit Housing Association is being formed. It's a high equity based community where we get the housing providers together to assist in building new homes for people, a new affordable housing if possible, whenever possible, wherever possible. Because it's equity based, they are getting representatives from all minorities in the province. And I was tapped to be the representative for people with disabilities. And I've learned since then that just how few shelter beds there are for us, how few affordable housing places there are for us. And I want to say, if anybody else is interested in housing stuff, please look into this if you have some time to give to the board, because I don't want to be the lone voice shouting accessibility all the time.
No, hello, I will join you.
We'd love to have you.
Send
But
me
Vicky,
the stuff, bro.
Well, Vicky, the next point is actually for you. Yesterday or the day before, forgive me, I'm not tracking that well right now, was the United Way's Housing Symposium. And one of the big things they had going was CLTs, Community Land Trusts.
Yeah,
the Halifax Community Land Trust. Oh, I asked, because I remember you recently moved into the condo there with Jen and a few others.
Yeah.
For people with disabilities, condos would count towards building a community land trust for affordable living for people with disabilities. And I thought you might want to look into the Halifax Land Trust also. If you need a contact with the United Way, reach out. I'll send it over to you.
Yeah, but send me all this in an email and I'll get on it.
I'll do my darndest. I'll reach out. You can, and we had for children. There's a child advocate public engagement series going on, and I attended one of those. And two things I'll relate from the disability perspective. Members of the public believe that people who are developmentally delayed should be kept in care of the minister indefinitely, which, as you may imagine, I'm not a proponent of.
No,
But I did ask the representative from DCS and Department of Education who were there. There is no person with disabilities on the steering committee, nobody to advocate for our people.
of
So if
course
you have
not.
any contact on that side, reach out.
Okay, I don't.
I hear texts coming in, but I'm visually impaired, so my voice reader keeps trying to talk over. Sorry. And for Miss Tammy, I heard you mention disability in the media. If you ever have a moment where you could talk to me, I have an idea for a charity for people with disabilities. In order to get more in the media, I've talked to ACTRA, and I just need some help over that hurdle. And if you were able to talk about it, maybe you'd be interested in helping out.
I can get in touch, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see there is a hand up by Nina. Thank you, Sean, for those pieces of information. And I sense there's going to be some connections made as a result of that. Nina, you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks. I just want to thank the presenters. There's a lot of valuable information. One of the things that I've been really passionate about and working on is creating a framework and network to help bring awareness to these opportunities, this news, this engagement, and just in terms of like both being what you can give and also what you need. That's not government related. That's run by people with lived experience, and that's community focused. And I've had so many ideas lately, and I just think it's so valuable to hear other people's ideas and to hear these things that like I'm creating a social media presence. I'm based in Ottawa, but just to bring all of these things together and to try to create a space that is what we need it to be. So I just want to say, like, if anyone wants to talk about something like this, like my dream is to have like city specific spaces where if someone goes to another place, they can see what organizations are there. They can see the accessibility info. They know what opportunities are going on. They know the outreach organizations, all of these sorts of things that I just think that would be really cool. So I personally am disabled, but this is like my passion that I'm just chipping away at as I go. But I love talking to like-minded people. So I'm going to put an email in the chat. Just wanted to say that. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. That sounds like a wonderful project.
Yeah, that's another thing. I know in this province everything is siloed, and the departments don't talk to each other, and there is no like, here's where you go if you need disability support. Here's the list of everything and everything they do. Yeah, that doesn't exist. So like, yeah, we need that desperately in this province. So yeah, I think in all provinces, honestly. So good on you for doing that. That's a lot of hard work. And you're probably not getting paid, so thanks.
One of the things that certainly we've been getting some feedback, both verbally as well as in the comments, that this information has been well received. You might have heard me say in the beginning that this is the beginning of a 3-part series. So we have 2 more. The small group of us who have been looking at planning for our future sessions, have put down some ideas on paper, but we haven't committed. So we're wondering whether or not any of the participants who are still with us, if you have other ideas or if there are particular areas that you might like us to focus on for our next 2, could you just put them in the chat function or speak to them if you wish? And that will help us in our planning to ensure that we are actually getting the kinds of webinar sessions and information that people would like to hear about.
I've got 2 that I'm just going to shout out. And I mean, you can probably speak to this, Tammy. The lack of accessibility in all forms in academia. When I was in academia, they didn't help me at all. You know, I said, can I do my test verbally? No. Can I take notes? No. I couldn't get a note taker. So I said, oh, I need notes. So I went to my professors and I said, can I audio record your lectures on my phone and then take them home and put them on my computer? And they said no, because it was their intellectual property and I would be plagiarizing. So I'm like, okay, so what do I do then? And they're like, best of luck. And I actually had to leave academia because I was there for 5 years. I was doing 3rd-year courses in my 5th year, and I couldn't keep up. And I had no notes. So I had to keep all this info in my brain. And it actually made me it exacerbated my mental health issues to the point where I said, if I stay here, I will die. So I left. So I'd like one about the inaccessibility of education, or even not just higher education, but education in general, and the segregation of neurodivergent kids.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes. Yeah, that's great. And there's been a few comments. So I've noted that. And Vicky, you're on our planning committee, so we'll be able to.
I know
do
that's
more.
why I would say other people probably have ideas, but
Yes.
that's my idea.
Thank you. And I did jot down a few more notes that people have made comments on. There was a question about how do we know about future ones. Once we get it a date and we get our topic and our speakers, we will send out as we did with this one. So stay tuned, whichever venue you receive this information. We try to send it out to each one of the organizations that we are involved with, so it goes out fairly widely.
Oh, somebody just said, do we need more speakers?
Right, yes.
It's probably yes.
Yes, so we'll take down this name. Are there any, Tammy, do you have any questions? Any?
I did notice that 2 folks had their hands up for a while and they put them back down. I don't want to call you out in case they don't want to speak now, but there were 2 folks who had their hands up previously. Did they want to ask a question now?
Can I throw an idea out there?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
So back in, I think 2012, I was with the Department of Education. One of my jobs was approving accessibility tools for the education environment, which was great. But there was nothing for people coming out of the program of whatever school they were in. Then I found the workplace attendant program. After I lost my ability to use my eyes to read and write, in 2021, I applied for our province's workplace attendant program. I found out there's only 2 people actually on that program. And the person who was in charge of it told me that because I wasn't on social assistance and didn't have a job, I wouldn't be able to apply for it. So this is something that we could talk about taking a look at. And
what do they mean you don't have a job? Do they mean because you work for yourself, or?
Well, no, I'm on CPPD now. I fought for the last couple of years to be on CPPD, Canadian Pension Plan for People with Disabilities. But and if you're on income assistance, you don't get a bus pass, you don't get dental, but if you do get a subsidy for low income, you actually get to pay a lower amount for rent. So I can speak to that. And but if you're trying to get a job, if you want a job, because goodness knows I want to do things. I want to feel like one of those people who go out and do a job every day like I used to. If you need help with that, you're supposed to be able to apply for this workplace attendant program with the province, except that you need to have a job to get the person to help you with the job. So how are you going to get hired? And sorry, somebody, whenever anybody speaks, my voice reader text. My voice reader reads it off, and it's hard to track two things at once. But if you need an attendant, you need to be on social assistance in order to apply, I was told, and you need to have a job. And then they'll pay for part of it. And the rate they pay is effectively less than minimum wage now. So it's
Yeah,
a
I'm very
program that needs to be looked at by our people and changed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I didn't realize it paid less than minimum wage.
I don't know exactly. I say effectively because it was 2021 when I did the math on it, and I cannot remember 2021 quite as well as I used to.
No, yeah, well, everything. I don't blame you, man. The world is, everything is everywhere at the moment.
Yes. Another thing we could look at is human rights complaints. I filed one in January, and the only reason they called me in June was I started tweeting about it. And they haven't really heard back from them in a couple months now. So my 1 year to get it resolved is coming up, at which point what happens? It's a complaint actually against the federal government for not providing documents in an accessible format for somebody who's visually impaired.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could also look at provincial human rights complaints. It's not a 6-month wait for them, but it is a couple month wait if you wanted to file a complaint through them.
Great. Thanks, Sean. I've been making notes as you've been speaking. I see a couple more hands up, and it's about 1:17. So let's go to Colleen and then to Irina.
Okay, just quickly, learning about the connection with disabilities and MAID, I find very disturbing, and I'm wondering if there needs to be an action done to raise that awareness and to try to stop this this trend of people with disabilities being encouraged or forced to die, commit suicide, if they don't have it. I'm wondering if that's something that needs to happen. I like what people are bringing up that have been mentioned by Vicky and Sean, some of these specific policies and what their actual impact is actually happening, I think would be interesting to look at. And then, of course, we need to get to the point of, well, what are we going to do to try to bring about change? So.
Yeah, I've said for years, like when Black Lives Matter happened, I was like, yes, this is good, go to them. But also, we need one like that type of giant movement for people with disabilities, for actions against, the current MAID policy, for actions of incarceration, because people with disabilities are more often incarcerated, like in the criminal justice system. So we need that. When I heard that MAID was going to get expanded, because in March they're going to open it up to people with mental illness. I'm like, why is nobody marching, climbing the steps of everything? Why aren't we doing a sit-in? Like, I wanted to go full 1960s, 70s, like old school, not violence, but what do they call civil disobedience? I'm like, why don't we do that? Because my people are dying. Like, I'm scared to go to the hospital now because what if they offer it to me? I'm terrified to go to the emergency room. Like, not that I would ever take it, but I don't want to be put in that situation. And
but we fought for this right for MAID, medical assistance in dying. I want that option to be open for me. I want to have the choice later on when things get bad again. I don't want this choice to be taken away from me. I have friends and family who are planning to take it when it becomes available to them in the spring. It's hard dealing with knowing that I'm going to have to say goodbye to them, but I'm not going to take away their choice because they're disabled They should be allowed to have the same choices I have.
But yes, but they shouldn't even be making that choice, because we should have I would agree with you if the systems were in place to give people what they need to stay alive and healthy, but they don't right now. So certain people with disabilities are taking it because they feel they have an option. What we really need to do is strengthen social safety nets so people feel like that it's not just
Yes, we need Bill C-22 to be stronger. Right now, it's only for ages 15 to 65. The youngest of us, the oldest of us, are ignored completely. The definitions for disability, who knows what they are? We've discussed how nebulous that is across Canada. And people with mental illnesses are often left out with things like the disability tax credit. The amounts being made are not going to be released. It's going to be decided in cabinet, where it's not in parliament, and any changes made could be done at any time in cabinet. So nothing can be done in parliament for people to know. Within reporting, it's every 5 years right now, which means a whole 4-year cycle of government could go by with nobody even being held accountable for it. Bill C-22 started off as the disability benefit with the idea of nothing about us without us, and now it's about us but without us. We need to advocate more for changes to that so that people can have that. Maybe expand it as a disability tax credit so it comes as extra money on your taxes, which doesn't get touched by the provinces.
yeah,
I would say that Colleen's comment about, the connection between disabilities and MAID might be a topic for us to carry on. I'm just a little looking at the time, and there are 2 hands still remaining. So I'm wondering if maybe I can go to Irina now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I've had some issues with my sound, so I'm glad you can. So my question is, does anyone know of any support services for someone that has filed an application with the Human Rights Tribunal? I am in that situation, and regardless of what happens, I have realized that anyone that has gone through the experience likely has been asked to sign an NDA, and for that reason they're fearful of sharing anything because they don't want to get in trouble, but also it can be extremely triggering. So I'm wondering if anyone knows of anything that's peer support related. It's not something that really would be promoted because, well, it's an NDA for a reason, and the court is not going to offer counseling or
Irina?
services. Yes.
Is it a federal or provincial tribunal?
Provincial.
Now, I can say on the federal Human Rights Tribunal site, it says contact Nova Scotia Legal Aid, which is a provincial body here in Nova Scotia. And they might do provincial ones as well. You should reach out and ask them. They're free, so.
That's for the legal side, but I'm talking about something that would allow me to talk about the emotional impact of the process that people take for granted, not you, but others that literally cannot understand unless they went through it.
Pause Mental Health does a free healthcare clinic in Halifax that does in-person or over the phone telephone counseling if you need that. They are counselors, so they are bound to confidentiality unless they're worried about you hurting yourself or someone else.
Yeah. So, well, I'm looking for something very specific to going to, with regards to experiencing discrimination and talking to someone who can understand what that feels like to gather all the documents, to relive it, the trauma, and what to do after revisiting that, because it's a very unique process. So if anyone has information about that, maybe you can share with the organizer of this meeting. I am personally very interested in that. That's not something easy to come by.
Great, thanks for the question. And I think everyone has heard that. So if there is any information out there that might be of assistance, please put that in the chat or get in touch with get in touch with us and we can hopefully pass the information on. And then I think we had one more person, Tanya.
Hi, thank you very much for putting on this this workshop, and I really appreciate it. And with regards to MAID, I have MCS, which is a recognized disability in Canada, and I face constant barriers, accessibility barriers. Just to even go to the hospital is very scary. So when Vicky mentioned that, it's terrifying, because with the excessive hand sanitizers and excessive cleaning that's been done since the pandemic, there's even more barriers. And the problem with my disability is when I have the opportunity, like when I have an exposure, because the fragrances and personal care products and cleaning products and even your laundry soap, they are neurotoxins. So they affect my ability to advocate for myself, because it causes brain fog. And then I run into situations where there's some people that are, maybe fragrance free, but they say, oh, I chose it for the health of my family, but I'm not going to advocate for you, even though they are in the position of being a counselor at a public, building. They will not be allies to help us. And in this situation, I can't do it alone. I need allies. So this is a kind of maybe a unique disability in the sense that we really need allyship, the same as other forms of discrimination like racism. And we need cooperation. And it means people changing the way they do things and, moving to non-toxic products, which is a win for everybody, because these products have also been shown long-term exposure cause cancer and heart issues and everything else. But to get people on board is it's so hard, and it's so demoralizing, and it puts my life in danger every time I have to go to the hospital. And to talk to people, I talked to the head of the physiotherapy department in our local hospital, and he had products on that had a lot of chemicals, and they were labeled unscented. And I'm explaining to him as I'm reacting that even if it says unscented, it could still have other chemicals that are masking the scent. So you really have to look at the ingredients. And I had a cute little handout, the David Suzuki Dirty Dozen little pamphlet. He refused to cooperate and pass it on to the physiotherapist in his department, and at the same time expose me in the effort of trying to solve a problem. And I ended up 4 days in bed with my brain scrambled, and I've never had that kind of reaction before. That was the most severe reaction. And I'm still fighting the same thing. Like, I've had meetings with the health minister. I've gone on camera and said, hey, we need to change the policy so that people don't use this loophole, to explain that fragrances are toxic chemicals, and that it's a win for everybody to follow policy. And even like we were talking about public housing, there is no public housing available that is fragrance free. I was talking to the head of the department today, and she says, I love Scentsy in the office. I use perfumed hairspray. I'm not going to change. And I'm like, you're in a public building. I can't bring in an application for housing to your building because I can't get through the front door. And, and the times that I do have an exposure where I have no choice, it progresses my illness. So, I really do understand why I have, why there's other MCS people choosing MAID rather than live like that, because they can't find fragrance-free housing. And also the poverty piece is an issue as well, because when you can't work, you don't have the income, and you're relying on, the lowest possible income. So it's just, it's a really big issue. MAID is an issue. I understand there's some people that want to choose it because it's a benefit for them. But we have people with MCS that are choosing it because they can't find any quality of life. And it's for things that could be easily solved, and that would help everybody. So I think if we could change the mindset that when you are an ally to persons with all disabilities, it's a win for you too. And so I really think it's important. And it's also important to try and see if we can get an MCS advocate involved. And often they won't get involved because of being so desperately sick. But, to keep that in mind, that these last 2 years have been hard for everybody, but they've been exceptionally hard. I haven't been able to go to a doctor's appointment because I can't take the bus to Sydney in 3 years or 2.5 years. Like, it's just, you know, the quality of life is gone. And then people look at you like you're crazy when you just say, you know, it would be really a simple fix. And, you know, and that's what I have to say. But thank you so much for this, this opportunity to hear all kinds of different perspectives. And I just hope that somehow people with environmental illness, MCS disability can somehow be included in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for sharing that with us. We can see that this has been a very difficult time through your stories and through your voice. And we thank you for sharing that with us. And I think it goes back to, you know, what Tammy had said in the very beginning of all those invisible disabilities that people have that dramatically affect their life. It also ties in a little bit to what Sean says, is that, you know, if the systems were there to support people and truly support them in an equitable way, then people wouldn't be faced with using policies or laws like medically assisted dying. So our structures are not well for supporting everyone. But so again, thank you, Tanya, and thank you to everyone for the comments they've made. I know that we're very close or a little bit over. I just wondered if Tammy had anything further that she wanted to say, and or if not, we'll wrap up.
I just want to thank everyone. A few people have shared very personal stories, and I, you know, this is why it's really important to share stories, because I could talk about policy all day and human rights, but unless you hear the actual impact it has on people, you don't really understand, and you still can't really understand what people are going through. So I just really want to thank everyone for sharing their stories. I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of, if people feel heard, that's one step towards empowerment. And I just think it's really important. So I just want to thank everyone for sharing their personal stories, whether it was in the chat or verbally, and also Vicky for your part of the presentation as well. So I just want to say thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. Oh, sorry, Vicky. I just wanted to thank both Vicky and Tammy for presenting both their stories and their information, and to everyone who did participate today. I know that people are starting to leave, and we will be sending out information, and we have lots to think about and talk about at our next planning committee. Vicky, did you have some final comments?
No, just if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'm all over the internets. So I'm at Vicky Levack on Twitter, and that's where I do most of my work stuff. And you can also do my email, which should be when you do the roundup of information. Colleen or whoever's gonna do that. Sandra, I don't know who's gonna do it. But you can feel free to include my email and my cell phone number if people want to reach out for questions or they need help or something.
Great. Good. Yes, that's fine. We will certainly try to keep people connected if they want to. So I would like to say once again, thank you to all, and have a great afternoon. Stay tuned. We'll be back in January with another topic.